Hi everyone, welcome to my second sew along. This time I'm sewing the Ida clutch bag pattern from I Think Sew Patterns. I sell this type of bag in my Etsy and British Craft House shops, so I thought it would be good to show you how I do it. Information on the pattern, fabric and tools is on screen now, and then I'll just get straight into the making. Hope you enjoy. So the first step in the process is to iron your fabric. So use a nice hot iron and some steam and get rid of all those wrinkles and creases. And here I'm just doing the same thing for my lining fabric. So now we've pressed the fabric, we need to move on to cutting out our pattern pieces. So remember there are two pattern pieces for this bag, flap, which needs to be cut out once, and the piece for the front and back, which needs to be cut out twice. So the front and back of the bag is exactly the same, so we use the same pattern piece for both. And both of these pattern pieces need to be cut on the fold. So if you don't want to fold your fabric, then draw around one side and flip the pattern piece over and then draw around the other side so that you have the full pattern like you can see me doing in this clip. If you have a patterned fabric, then think about the placement of the design and where you want that to sit on your bag and place the pattern piece accordingly, making best use of the design and the amount of fabric you have available. So draw around the paper pattern with chalk or disappearing pen. So once you've drawn around your pattern pieces, it's time to cut them out. So use a nice sharp pair of scissors, and remember not to use the same ones that you use to cut out your paper pattern, as they won't be sharp enough. And then take nice long snips using the full length of the blade so that you can get a nice smooth cut edge. So the yellow floral fabric was my outer fabric, and I now need to move on to cutting out my lining pieces. I need to cut out exactly the same pieces as I did for the outer fabric. So one flap piece and two of the front and back pieces. Then the final stage of the cutting out process is to cut the interfacing. So this is the foam interfacing that I'm using. And again, I'm cutting out exactly the same pattern pieces as I did for the outer fabric and the lining. So one flat piece and two of the front and back piece. So by the time the cutting out is complete, I'll have three flat pieces, one in outer fabric, one in lining and one in interfacing, and six front and back pieces, two in the outer fabric, two in the lining, and two in the interfacing. Now I'm moving on to fusing the interfacing onto my outer fabric pieces, so the front, the back and the flap. So I'm placing the wrong side of the fabric onto the adhesive side of the interfacing and aligning them perfectly so all four edges match, and then placing my iron on top and holding it for a few seconds and then moving on to another area until the interfacing is completely adhered to the outer fabric. And the outer fabric should be completely smooth, no bubbles or wrinkles, so that the interfacing and the fabric are now just one piece. And this is what it should look like after you've fused it together. So you could just use your fused fabric as it is now and move on to constructing the bag, but I like to quilt my fabric so it has a nice texture to it, and I just like the quilting process, so I do it whenever I can. As you get nice smooth quilting lines, there's a few options that you have. You could use the quilting guide bar on your sewing machine if you have one, or you could draw lines on your fabric with a heat erasable pen, or you can just use masking tape like I'm doing here. We're finally on to some actual sewing now. Woohoo! So as you can see here, I'm just stitching just outside the edges of the masking tape, which will eventually create nice diamond shapes across the fabric. Once I've sewn on both sides of the tape, I take it off and place it down again and just repeat that process until I've done the whole piece. I'm doing it diagonally across the fabric to get that diamond shape, but you could do squares or you could just freehand it. The choice is yours. Now on to applying the magnetic snap. Firstly to the front piece. So I'm taking the original pattern piece, which has the placement of the magnetic snap located on it, and transferring that placement onto the fabric. So you need to try and be as accurate as you can with this, because if it's not in the right place, then the corresponding snap piece on the flap won't reach it when you close the bag. So take your time and use the snap itself to locate the position of the prongs in the middle of the circle that you're drawing. Once you've made the markings for the placement of the snap, you need to cut through the fabric with small little slits exactly on the markings you made for the prongs of the snap, i.e. in the centre of that circle. I'm using snips here which are nice and sharp, and then you can actually attach the snap by pushing the prongs through the slits you've made, and on the back pushing them to the sides over the little metal plate, as you can see me doing here. Then you need to do exactly the same thing on the lining flap piece, but because the lining is more flimsy than the outer fabric, you need to cut a small piece of lighter weight interfacing and fuse it in the position of the snap first to help stabilise that area. So just make sure that you put the interfacing on the wrong side of the lining and that the main part of the snap goes on the right side. So now on to the actual construction of the bag. We firstly need to lay the front and back outer pieces right sides together. So that's good sides together, the ones with your pretty fabric. And then pin them around the bottom of the bag on both sides. And then sew those three sides with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. But do remember to leave the top open. And here I'm using clips instead of pins, as it's a bit easier with the thick foam interfacing. To help remove some bulk from the corners, here I'm just trimming across both of them with the scissors, and this will help to make it easier to have a nice clean corner when we turn the bag right sides out later on. Now we need to sew the lining in the same way. However, with the lining we need to leave a gap at the bottom of about 5 inches, and this is so that we can turn it through when we've finished. So I'm marking the start and finish of that gap with double pins to remind me to start and stop sewing at those points. The next step is to make the flap. So we need to place the exterior flap and the lining flap pieces right sides together, pin round them or clip round them, whatever you're using, pins or clips, and sew around the 2 diagonal sides, but leave the top straight side open. And now I'm trimming that corner just like I did in the previous step. So now it's time to turn the flap right sides out, so reach inside and pull it through. And you can use a wooden point turner to try and get a nice crisp point on the end of the flap, just like I'm doing here. Now it's time to get the iron out and press the flap nice and flat. So I'm trying to roll the edges over slightly so that the lining doesn't show from the right sides. And I'm also using a pressing cloth here to protect the outer fabric from the iron. Off camera, I then went ahead and top stitched the flap about 1/4 of an inch from the edges on the 2 sides, not the top. And this is what it now looks like. Now I'm turning the main part of the bag right sides out and pushing out the corners with the point turner like I did before. Now we need to attach the flap to the main body of the bag. So I'm pinning or clipping the flap right sides together with the back of the main body of the bag. And then I'll take it to the sewing machine and baste it together with a long stitch. We'll stitch this area again properly later on, so there's no need to sew it too securely at this stage. Do make sure that you're just pinning the flap to the back of the bag and not the front as well, like I did here. I'm now attaching the main bag and the lining by placing the main bag inside the lining with right sides together. So this means that your bag will be right sides out and your lining will be wrong sides out, and the flap will be sandwiched in the middle between the main bag and the lining. And then we need to pin the main bag and the lining together around the top opening and sew those together with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Here I'm at the sewing machine sewing around that seam, and as you can see I've taken the extension table off my sewing machine, which allows me to sew around the full opening of the bag much easier. And here I'm just notching those side seams because there's quite a bunch of fabric and interfacing there, just to remove any bulkiness in that area again. Now we can see why we left that gap in the bottom of the lining. We need to turn the whole bag through that hole. We need to take our time with this and carefully tease it through. So push out all of the corners and then find the lining gap and sew that closed approximately 1/8 of an inch from the edge. Here it is closed up, and we need to push the lining back into the bag, back in its proper place. As a final step, I'm ironing the bag, paying special attention to the top opening. And I'm pressing that so it sits inside without the lining peeking out. And then the last sewing step is to top stitch around the opening about 1/8 of an inch from the edge. And here's our finished clutch bag.